My stepmother thought she could erase me from my father's will and take everything for herself. She walked into that lawyer's office certain she had already won. But what she never saw coming was the lawyer I brought with me, the one who would turn her arrogance into her downfall. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. Asterisk, the day of the will reading is still carved into my memory like a scar, sharp, unforgettable, and oddly instructive. It was supposed to be the last step in honoring my father's life, a moment of formality where his wishes would be read aloud and respected. Instead, it felt like walking into an ambush. When I arrived at the law office, my stepmother was already there. She was dressed in deep black, a veil pinned to her hair, as though she were auditioning for a role rather than mourning the man she had married. Her expression wasn't grief. It was smug triumph, the kind that leaks out at the edges even when someone tries to hide it. I had always known she was manipulative, but that morning she carried herself as if she had already won. She spoke to the receptionist like the building belonged to her, tapping her nails against the counter while announcing, "The widow of Mr. Thomas is here. Everything is being transferred to me." The way she said it, like the conclusion had already been signed, made my stomach tighten. Inside, I felt a storm rising, but on the outside, I stayed calm. That was something my father always admired about me, my ability to stay steady in turbulent moments. I took my seat across from her, at the long oak table, its polished surface reflecting the stack of documents that would decide our futures. She barely glanced at me. When she did, it was only to let out a low chuckle and mutter, "I told you there was no point in showing up." Her arrogance in that moment did something to me. It sparked the fire that carried me through the entire ordeal. She truly believed I was powerless, that I would sit quietly while she stripped me of the very legacy my father had wanted me to carry forward. What she didn't realize, what she could never have imagined, was that my father and I had spoken before his death. He had left me something she could never manipulate or take away. The truth, sealed in his final will. But I kept that knowledge to myself. I let her think she was in control, let her bask in that illusion, because when the truth finally came to light, it would shatter her confidence in the most satisfying way possible. That morning, as the lawyer entered with his briefcase and began laying out the papers, my pulse steadied. I wasn't walking into a defeat. I was walking into the moment where my stepmother's greed would collide with my father's foresight. And I was ready. Asterisk, before I can tell you how the drama unfolded in that lawyer's office, I need to take you back to when things were still normal. Though in truth, they were never all that normal once my stepmother came into the picture. My father, Thomas, was the kind of man people admired. He wasn't wealthy when he was young, but through hard work and careful planning, he built a comfortable life for himself and, by extension, for me. He was steady, deliberate, and deeply loyal to the people he loved. After my mother passed when I was a teenager, it was just the two of us for several years. We had our routines, dinners at the same little diner every Friday, quiet walks through the park on Sundays, and long conversations about everything from books to business. Those years, despite the grief we both carried, felt safe. I knew where I stood. My father's love wasn't something I ever had to question. That changed the day he introduced me to Linda, my future stepmother. Linda was dazzling in a way that felt performative. She was younger than my father by a good decade, dressed impeccably, and always seemed aware of her own reflection. She had the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind that felt like a mask. When I first met her, she leaned across the table, touched my hand, and said, "We're going to be such good friends." I remember wanting to believe her, but the sharpness in her gaze told me otherwise. At first, she was polite enough, but gradually, her behavior revealed itself. She wasn't interested in being a stepmother. She was interested in being the center of attention. Around my father, she was affectionate, attentive, even doting. But when his back was turned, her mask would slip. She'd make little remarks like, "You're lucky your father keeps paying for all your needs. Most kids your age don't have it so easy." Or, "Your father and I will finally be able to enjoy life without so many obligations." It didn't take me long to realize I was the obligation she was talking about. Still, my father seemed happy, and I didn't want to tarnish that for him. He had given so much of himself over the years that seeing him smile again felt worth swallowing my discomfort. So, I stayed quiet, even as Linda's comments grew sharper and her presence in our home more suffocating. There were warning signs, though ones I only see clearly in hindsight. She'd linger over my father's financial papers a little too long, asking detailed questions about his accounts and investments. She would walk through the house making comments like, "When this is all mine, I'll redecorate completely. I can already see where the new chandelier will go." Whenever she said things like that, my father would laugh it off, brushing away the tension with a gentle, Now, Linda, this is a family home, not just a project." But I could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. For my part, I carried on. I focused on my work, on my own life outside the house, and tried not to let her erode the bond I had with my father. I told myself she was more bluster than threat, that her greed was shallow and obvious, and that my father was too smart to be manipulated by it. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, there was a quiet fear I couldn't shake. I worried that, one day, when my father was no longer here to see through her act, Linda would finally get what she wanted. She would strip everything of meaning, turning my father's hard-earned legacy into just another prize for her endless vanity. And as it turned out, that fear wasn't unfounded. The shift from suspicion to certainty came swiftly, like a door slamming shut. My father's health had been declining for some time, but he faced it with quiet dignity. When he finally passed, my grief was heavy but not unexpected. I thought, perhaps naively, that this would be a time for unity, for sharing memories and honoring the man we both loved. But Linda saw his passing differently. For her, it was an opening a chance to claim everything she had been circling like a hawk. A few days after the funeral, I received a letter in the mail, a formal notice about the will reading scheduled at my father's lawyer's office. The envelope was heavy in my hand, stamped with the name of the firm I had known since childhood. My father had used the same lawyer for years, and just seeing the letter gave me a small measure of comfort. This was where his wishes would finally be heard. But before I could even respond, Linda intercepted me. I remember the scene vividly. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the unopened letter resting beside a half-empty cup of tea. She walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and eyed the envelope with a glint of satisfaction. Without asking, she picked it up and turned it over in her hands. "You don't need to worry about this," she said casually, almost dismissively. "I've already spoken with the lawyer. Everything has been taken care of." Her tone was matter-of-fact, like someone discussing a grocery list. My pulse quickened. Taken care of. I asked, trying to keep my voice even. She smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the smile of someone who believed they were 2 moves ahead. Thomas made sure I was provided for. Everything will come to me. Honestly, it's better this way. You won't have to be burdened with any of the responsibilities. You can just move on. Her words hit me like ice water. Move on? From my father's home, from his savings, from the keepsakes he had promised me since I was a child, from the legacy he had built with such care. I managed to steady my voice, but my hands trembled under the table. I'll still be attending the will reading, I said quietly. Her smile faltered just for a moment before she leaned down, resting her manicured fingers on the table beside me. Suit yourself, but don't expect much. Your father knew who really cared for him. You'll only embarrass yourself showing up. That was the moment the line was crossed. It wasn't just greed, it was erasure. She wasn't content with taking his possessions. She wanted to erase my place in his life entirely, to rewrite the story as if I had never mattered. I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. But beneath the shock, something else stirred. Resolve. She believed she had already won. She believed I was powerless, and that belief would become her undoing. I didn't argue further. Instead, I let her walk away, still smirking, still confident, because in that moment, I made a silent promise. When the day of the will reading came, I would be there, and I wouldn't be alone. Asterisk. The morning of the will reading arrived heavy with tension. I woke early, unable to rest, my mind replaying every smug word Linda had thrown at me. I dressed carefully, not in mourning black but in something simple and respectful. My father had always taught me that appearances mattered in quiet, subtle ways, and I wanted to honor him not just in what I wore, but in how I carried myself. When I arrived at the law office, the air was thick with polished wood and quiet authority. The receptionist led me to the same oak-paneled conference room, where my father had signed documents years earlier. I remembered being a child, waiting outside this very office, my feet swinging above the floor while my father explained investments to me in gentle, patient tones. Walking into that room again felt like stepping into a battlefield disguised. As a memory, Linda was already seated at the head of the table. She looked like she belonged there, or at least, that's what she wanted everyone to think. She wore a black silk dress with pearls that gleamed against her throat, and she held herself with the posture of a queen expecting her crown. She didn't look at me when I walked in. Instead, she leaned toward the lawyer seated beside her, speaking in low, conspiratorial tones that carried just far enough for me to catch words like everything and transfer. When I took my seat across from her, she finally acknowledged me with a faint smirk. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You came after all. I suppose you need to hear it in person. Closure, you know." I clenched my jaw but said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence unsettled her more than anger ever could. The lawyer, an older gentleman with silver hair and a steady, no-nonsense demeanor, cleared his throat and began to arrange the papers in front of him. "We are gathered to read the last will and testament of Mr. Thomas," he said. "This will, executed and notarized on." Before he could continue, Linda cut him off with a little laugh. "We all know what it says. Thomas wanted me taken care of. I was his wife. After all, everything comes to me. Isn't that right?" She turned her sharp gaze on me then, her eyes glittering with malice. "You should try to be gracious about it. It's what he would have wanted." Her words landed like a slap, not because they carried truth, but because of the sheer audacity. Behind them, my father had loved me with a steadfast devotion. He would never have erased me from his legacy. But Linda was so confident, so arrogant, that she had convinced herself her fantasy was already fact. As the lawyer tried to continue, she interrupted again, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied sigh. "I've already made plans, you know," she said casually. "The house will need a full renovation. Thomas never had much taste for style. And as for the savings, well, I'll finally be able to travel the way I've always wanted. Paris, Milan, maybe a villa in Spain." She laughed lightly, then added, "You'll find your own way, dear. Everyone does." The words twisted in my gut. It wasn't just greed, it was cruelty. She wanted me to hear every detail of the life she planned to build on top of my father's grave, as though my pain added spice to her victory. I kept my composure, though every muscle in my body ached to lash out. Instead, I sat straighter, folded my hands neatly on the table, and met her eyes with a calm steadiness that seemed to irritate her. If she expected me to crumble, she was going to be disappointed. What she didn't know was that the very documents she dismissed, the ones sitting neatly in the lawyer's briefcase, held a truth she couldn't rewrite. And the deeper she sank into her arrogance, the harder the fall would be when reality finally struck. Asterisk. As the lawyer shuffled his papers, preparing to proceed with the reading, Linda's confidence only seemed to swell. She leaned back in her chair like a woman awaiting a coronation, tapping her manicured nails against the polished wood in an impatient rhythm. When he paused to adjust his glasses, she filled the silence with her voice, making sure every word landed like a dart. "You know," she said with a little laugh, "Thomas and I used to talk about this all the time. He always said I was the only one who truly understood him, the only one who took care of him in his final years." She turned toward me, her eyes sharp and gleaming. "He worried about you, of course, but he knew you weren't ready for responsibility. That's why he made sure I would be the one in charge. I suppose that's hard for you to hear, but really, it's for the best." Her tone was surly, but her words carried poison. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I forced myself to remain outwardly calm. Inside, though, it was like something cracked. I had endured her barbs before, her endless little jabs about my dependence, my supposed weakness, my unworthiness. But this was different. She wasn't just diminishing me. She was twisting my father's memory to suit her own narrative. She was painting him as a man who doubted me, who would betray his own promises. That was intolerable. I thought back to the quiet evenings I had shared with my father in the months before his passing. He had sat across from me, his face drawn with fatigue but still alive with clarity. He had taken my hand and said, "Don't let her intimidate you. I know what she's after, and I've made sure she won't succeed. I trust you to carry this forward." I held onto those words like an anchor now, hearing Linda rewrite him, reshape him into a man who would leave me behind. It ignited something cold and unyielding inside me. The breaking point wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and absolute. I looked at her across the table, at the smug curve of her mouth, at the way she had already convinced herself she had won. And I knew I could no longer afford to simply endure. I would not let her desecrate his memory. I would not let her erase me. At that moment, my role shifted. I was no longer the dutiful daughter silently tolerating her cruelty. I was no longer the passive observer of her greed. I became something else, a force she had never accounted for. The decision crystallized with startling clarity. I would fight her, not with anger or desperation, but with the very weapon my father had left me: the truth. She thought she was untouchable, but the ground beneath her was already fragile, and I was ready to let her fall. As the lawyer cleared his throat to begin reading in earnest, I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands, mirroring her posture but with an entirely different purpose. Let her bask in her false victory. Let her gloat. Every word out of her mouth only made what was coming more satisfying, because I knew something she didn't. The tide was about to turn. What Linda never understood about my father was that behind his gentle exterior lived a mind as sharp as a blade. He was a man who planned carefully, who thought several steps ahead, especially when it came to protecting the people he loved. In those final months, as his health declined, he had grown wary of her constant questions about his assets, her sudden interest in accounts and property she had once ignored. One evening, not long before he passed, he called me into his study. The room smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, lined with shelves of books he had collected over decades. He looked frailer than I wanted to admit. His shoulders slumped, his skin pale, but his eyes burned with determination. "Linda will try to take everything," he said quietly. "I can see it in her, but I've made changes. I want you to know exactly where you stand." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside was a draft of his updated will, notarized and signed, with clear clauses that left the bulk of his estate to me. Linda would be provided for a stipend to ensure she was comfortable, but the inheritance, the family home, the accounts, and the heirlooms were entrusted to me. I remember pressing a hand to my mouth, overcome by the weight of it all. He squeezed my other hand firmly. "Don't let her bully you. When the time comes, bring someone you can trust. I've already spoken with my lawyer, but I want you to have your own representation. She'll try to twist things. Don't let her." Those words had echoed in my mind ever since, and so, as Linda sat across from me at that conference table, smug and preening, she assumed I had walked in unprepared. She believed the only liar in the room was hers to manipulate, that I would sit defenseless while she claimed her prize. But she was wrong, because sitting just a few chairs down, quietly reviewing his briefcase, was my lawyer, a trusted friend of my father's, someone who knew exactly what to expect. I had contacted him the moment the will reading was scheduled. He had the updated documents, sealed and notarized, ready to present. That was my weapon. Foresight, not mine alone, but my father's. He had given me the gift of preparation, and I intended to wield it carefully. I said nothing as Linda rambled about her travel plans and redecorating schemes. Instead, I sat in calm silence, every second strengthening my resolve. She believed she was in control, but in truth, every word out of her mouth was tightening the noose of her own arrogance. The plan was simple. When the moment came, when she was at her most certain, the truth would be revealed. And because it was written in ink, signed, notarized, and witnessed, she wouldn't be able to spin or manipulate her way out of it. For once, she would face something she couldn't charm, threaten, or twist to her advantage, and I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when the floor dropped out from beneath her. The room felt suspended in time, like the air itself was holding its breath. The lawyer at the head of the table began reading through the preliminary legal statements, his voice steady and practiced. Linda leaned back, her lips curved into that infuriating little smile, as though every word was simply a formality confirming what she already knew. When he paused to shuffle the next set of papers, she couldn't resist adding her own commentary. "I think we can skip the dull details, can't we?" she said breezily, waving one hand in the air. "Thomas left everything to me. That's what really matters. I felt my pulse steady, my earlier anger sharpening into something far colder. It was time. I turned slightly in my chair and gave a small nod to the man seated at my side, my lawyer. Quietly, without drama, he slid his briefcase onto the table and clicked it open. The metallic snap of the locks seemed to echo in the silence. Linda frowned, her smirk faltering. "And who exactly is this?" she asked, her tone sharp with sudden suspicion. "My representation," I said simply, my voice calm and level. "My father made sure I would be prepared for today." Her eyes narrowed. "Representation? What for?" "This is my will reading." That was the moment my lawyer pulled out a folder and laid it neatly on the table. The firm stamp of notarization gleamed on the front page. "Not quite," he said evenly. "This is the most recent version of Mr. Thomas's will. Executed, signed, and properly witnessed. It supersedes any previous drafts." The color drained from Linda's face. The lawyer at the head of the table adjusted his glasses, scanning the document carefully. After a long pause, he gave a small nod. "Yes," he said, his tone measured. "This is the valid and final testament of Mr. Thomas. We will proceed with this version." Linda sat bolt upright. "That's impossible. I was told he told me." Her voice cracked, sputtering with disbelief. But the reading continued. Clause by clause, my father's wishes came to life in the lawyer's steady voice. "The family home left to me. The savings and accounts entrusted to my care. The heirlooms, the antiques, the things that held the weight of memory de mine and Linda. A modest stipend, enough to live comfortably, but nothing compared to what she had imagined." I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, my face a mask of composure. Inside, though, I felt the knot of months' of tension slowly unraveling. My father's voice echoed in my memory. "Don't let her bully you. I've made sure she won't succeed." He had kept his promise. As the lawyer reached the end of the document, Linda's breathing grew louder, ragged with fury. She shook her head violently, as though refusing to accept the words spoken aloud. It was happening. The tide had finally turned, and there was no undoing it. The last words of the will seemed to hang in the air like a bell's final toll. Silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of Linda's manicured nails drumming against the table. Her face, once smug and confident, was a shade paler than I'd ever seen it. "No," she whispered, almost to herself. Then louder. "No, this is wrong. This is a fraud." Her voice climbed into a shrill pitch that made everyone at the table stiffen. She pointed a shaking finger at me. You set this up. You're manipulating everything. Thomas promised me everything. Do you hear me?" I remained calm, though my heart was beating hard in my chest. "I didn't manipulate anything, Linda. My father simply ensured that his real wishes would be respected. What you tried to do convincing everyone of an outdated draft, that was the fraud." Her chair scraped back as she surged to her feet, glaring at the lawyer with wild desperation. "You can't let this stand. She's tricking all of you. I'll contest it. I'll sue. But my lawyer was already prepared. Without raising his voice, he said, "Mrs. Thomas, you should be aware that this will has been verified, witnessed, and notarized. Contesting it would not only fail, but the courts could interpret your actions as frivolous or malicious. In fact," he slid another sheet forward, "there is also an affidavit here detailing the circumstances under which Mr. Thomas expressed concern about coercion from you in the months leading up to his passing. That's been entered into the record as well." Linda froze. It was like watching a storm break over her face, rage, fear, denial all colliding at once. That's a lie. He never. Her voice faltered when she caught sight of the notary's seal, and for a flicker of a second, her eyes darted away. She knew. She knew. The lawyer at the head of the table cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable but firm. Mrs. Thomas, the will is legally binding. The distribution is final. I must ask you to respect the process. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Respect. Respect. After everything I've done, after everything I was promised. She swung her furious gaze back to me. You're a snake. You've stolen what was mine. I met her eyes steadily, not flinching. It was never yours to steal. You tried to rewrite the story to suit yourself, but the truth has a way of coming out. That was when it hit her. The inevitability. The fact that she had played her cards, and the deck had been stacked against her all along, not by me, but by her own arrogance. Her shoulders slumped, the fight leaking out of her in slow, jerky movements. For once, she had no clever words, no biting insults, just silence, and the weight of her failure pressing down on her. I could almost hear the echo of karmic justice ringing in that silence. The silence after Linda's outburst was thick, almost unbearable. She stood there trembling, her hands balled into fists, eyes darting wildly between me, the lawyers, and the folder of documents that had just dismantled her fantasy of control. I let the moment stretch before finally speaking. Linda, I said softly, almost kindly, you assumed my father would reward greed and cruelty. But he didn't. He rewarded loyalty and honesty. That's why you're standing here empty-handed. Her lips parted in disbelief, as if she had just been slapped. The lawyer slid the signed will back across the table, his voice calm and resolute. Distribution of the estate will proceed according to Mr. Thomas's wishes. This is final. It was in that moment, as the legal seal of finality pressed down on her, that Linda broke. The smugness, the power games, the venomous confidence, all of it drained from her like water through a sieve. She collapsed back into her chair, clutching at the armrests as though they could anchor her to the control she no longer had. You'll regret this, she whispered, but the words lacked bite. They were hollow, shaky. Even she knew it. I stood, smoothing the hem of my dress, my movements steady and deliberate. For so long, she had tried to paint me as weak, naive, someone she could bully into silence. But now the roles were reversed. I leaned just slightly toward her, my voice low enough that only she could hear. No, Linda, the only person with regrets here is you. Her eyes flashed with something between fury and despair, but she had no retort, nothing left to throw at me. The lawyers gathered their papers, the meeting drawing to a close, and in that single, crystallized moment, the truth was undeniable. She had stolen, schemed, manipulated, and ended up with less than nothing. That was the justice. Not just that I had one, but that she had destroyed her own future with the very greed that drove her. As I walked out of the room, I didn't feel the triumph of gloating. I felt the calm, bone-deep relief of someone who had finally, fully defended what was right. The weight I'd been carrying for so long finally slipped free. The door clicked shut behind me, and with it, Linda's reign of cruelty ended. In the days that followed, word spread quickly through the family about what had happened at the will reading. I didn't have to explain much. Everyone who had been there carried their own version of the story, whispering it to others in tones of disbelief and, in many cases, relief. Linda's downfall was no longer just mine to witness, it became common knowledge. The same woman who had strutted through family gatherings as though she were queen of the estate was now left with nothing but a modest stipend. It was poetic. I heard, through quiet channels, that she tried to contest the will anyway, but the affidavit my father had left behind, coupled with the airtight legality of his final document, shut down her attempt almost immediately. Worse for her, the frivolous challenge only racked up expensive legal fees she had to cover herself. For the first time, Linda's mask of wealth and power cracked. The glossy exterior faded. She had to downsize her lifestyle, selling off the designer clothes and jewelry she'd once flaunted so casually. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had married my father for his security, and in the end, her greed had left her more insecure than ever. As for me, the inheritance didn't feel like a windfall, it felt like a responsibility. I used it wisely, honoring my father's wishes. I secured the family home, ensured my own financial stability, and even set aside funds for causes he had cared about deeply. Every decision I made carried the echo of his voice, guiding me, reminding me that integrity always mattered more than appearances. The greatest change, though, wasn't material. It was internal. For so long, I had lived under Linda's shadow, her constant belittling, her manipulations, her smug assumption that she held all the power. Walking away from that while reading, I felt a freedom I hadn't known in years. The family began to see me differently too. Cousins, uncles, even old family friends reached out, not just to congratulate me, but to quietly admit they'd always suspected Linda's cruelty. They treated me with a newfound respect, as though surviving her storm and standing tall in the end had revealed a strength they hadn't recognized before. And Linda, she faded into the background. Once the center of attention, she was now a cautionary tale whispered about at gatherings she no longer had the means or the invitation to attend. When I look back on it now, I realized the inheritance itself wasn't the true victory. The victory was justice. It was watching the scales finally balance, watching greed collapse under its own weight, and knowing that my father's trust in me had been honored. The moral, at least for me, is simple. Entitlement and manipulation may win small battles, but integrity always wins the war. And with that chapter of my life closed, I was finally free to write the next one on my own terms. ***.